Hi, my name is Mecca Burris. I'm a PhD candidate at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, in the United States. And today I'm going to talk about the role of food insecurity and stress within the age at menarche among US adolescents. So just to start, I'm going to talk about some background information and sort of introduce the topic. So menarche refers to the first regular menstruation among girls, and it typically occurs 2 to 3 years after the start of puberty. And it's what we consider an important life history event. Puberty, more generally, is considered to be a key life history period, and we use puberty, the start of puberty, and also the age at menarche to estimate an individual's life history trajectory. And that's because this period involves large energetic shifts, where in puberty we see that after an initial growth spurt, the growth rate actually slows down, and then excess energy is shifted towards reproductive maturation and also function, such as the production of ovarian steroids. The timing of puberty and menarche more specifically is influenced by both genetics and environmental factors. So there are a few genes that we know code for pubertal timing, pubertal onset, and rate. We see correlations, for example, between maternal age at menarche and their daughter's age at menarche. However, it seems that environmental factors like stress and nutrition have a larger role. And stress and nutrition are two of the sort of most researched environmental factors that we know influence age at menarche. Stress, early life stress, and stress during childhood has often been connected to earlier menarche. And using life history theory, we understand this to be likely an adaptation, a developmental adaptation to a risky environment. So psychosocial stress is an environmental cue of mortality risk, and that might be infant mortality risk, or it might be adult morbidity and mortality. And so beginning your reproductive efforts earlier through starting puberty or experiencing menarche earlier, which is associated with earlier first birth, can be adaptive in a risky environment because it can expand your reproductive opportunity. So if you start reproducing earlier, you might have more children, and when there is a high infant mortality rate, this increases your odds that your children will survive. If there is a high morbidity rate among adults, then starting reproducing earlier gives you more time to raise those children before the risk takes a toll. And then, of course, nutrition is important for the timing of any developmental period and the rate of development because it takes a lot of energy, right? So puberty especially is an energetically costly period because an individual is still growing, they're still developing the brain as well as the skeleton and the muscle systems. And then also they have to begin investing in reproduction. All of this while maintaining their own physiology and immune functioning. So puberty in adolescence is very costly. And so when we have undernutrition, we see that this is often connected to delayed menarche because an individual just simply doesn't have enough metabolic resources to mature sexually while surviving. But then overnutrition is associated with earlier menarche. And this makes sense, right? Because an abundance of energy would allow an individual to invest energy in both reproduction and somatic survival. So why do we care about the timing of menarche? Well, menarche of a population is not only used to just get an idea of the health of the population, but we know that early menarche is associated with increased risks for many diseases. So both in adolescence and in adulthood, we see higher risks for mental health disorders, asthma, cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, as well as various cancers. And it's important to remember that just because something is adaptive, so beginning earlier reproductive maturation and reproduction may be adaptive in a risky environment, there are always trade-offs. There are always consequences to adaptations. And so what we see here is it looks like these energetic trade-offs that are happening with earlier menarche, earlier puberty, are contributing to later life health disparities. So knowing this, knowing the role of stress and nutrition within menarche, I really became interested in the role of food insecurity, specifically household food insecurity, because in the US, especially, food insecurity is associated with stress, psychosocial stress, like worry and anxiety, and also malnutrition. So in the US, food insecurity is typically associated with overnutrition, as well as micronutrient deficiencies, rather than undernutrition. And this is because in our country, the unhealthy foods, the foods that are ultra processed, the foods that have a lot of calories, that are made with our country's commodities like corn and soy and meat and dairy, those are the cheapest foods in our country. And they're cheaper than healthy, fresh produce and whole foods and organic foods, etc. And so what we see is that households that are food insecure are often overweight, have overnutrition, have an abundance of fat, of sugar, of calories, of animal products. And so we predicted that knowing that food insecurity is associated with overnutrition in the US, as well as stress and anxiety, we predicted that it would contribute or predict earlier age at menarche among our sample. And then another goal was to better understand the connections between household food insecurity, nutritional status, and allostatic load, which is an index for stress that I will talk about next, among adolescent girls specifically. So I, with the help and advice of my advisor, used our National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey data sets from the years 2009 to 2014. These are conducted every 2 years among a nationally representative sample. And so I merged 3 of those data sets into one set using Stata. And I looked specifically at girls aged 12 to 15 who had reached menarche. This is because the last reported mean age at menarche was 12.3 years. And so I wanted to capture the other variables like household food security, allostatic load, and various other known predictors that have been published in the past near the timing of menarche. And another thing is that in this, what we call NHANES data set, we only get the age at menarche for individuals age 12 or older. So then I looked at household food security, which is determined by a questionnaire that we use called the US Household Food Security Survey module. And it has a number of questions that relate to the household as well as any children in the household. And then it gives the individuals a score and ranks them into different food security categories. And then we have allostatic load. And so allostatic load is what is referred to as the wear and tear of the body after continually using the stress response. So we see people who have had chronic stress or a lot of up and down with their stress in the past. They have higher allostatic load scores, and the score is determined by using a variety of biomarkers that are associated with allostasis. And then you see if the biomarkers are in a high risk category or not, and then you sum the number that are considered high risk, and you get an allostatic load score. And so we use blood pressure, various lipids, glycosylated hemoglobin, albumin creatine ratio, and then also BMI, body mass index. And then we controlled for or looked at the things that have been previously known to relate with age at menarche. And so we compared the means among categorical groups, the mean age at menarche specifically, and then we did categorical regression as well as linear regression to understand which variables significantly predict age at menarche in our sample, and all of these controlled for age. So we had 424 girls total, although we did use the Stata survey function tool, which weights the sample, and so our weighted sample had over 1 million individuals. Our mean age of our girls, 13.6 years. 22% of the households would be considered poverty using the US poverty threshold. And the mean age at menarche was 11.65 years, which is quite lower than the last published mean. And then our sample was mostly non-Hispanic white, but we had 15% non-Hispanic Black and 23.7% Hispanic Mexican American. Food security was mostly high for our sample, but we did have 14% in the low category, 12 in the marginal, 7 in the very low. Allostatic load, most individuals had a low score. We had to combine our marginal and high allostatic load categories because they were too small. And then for BMI, we use the CDC percentile cutoffs, and you can see that most of our sample is in this normal BMI range, what is considered a normal rate, which is between the 5th and the 85th percentile. But then we did have sort of a high amount in the obese category, which is greater than or equal to the 95th percentile. We had 22% of our sample in that obese category. And then we did first looked at independent predictors to see how they independently predicted age at menarche, and we found that race and ethnicity, specifically associating with being white or identifying as white, predicted later age at menarche when we compared to those who identify as Black or Hispanic Mexican American. BMI as a continuous variable predicted age at menarche, so as BMI decreased, age at menarche increased. And then we see the same pattern with BMI categories, where those who are underweight predicted later age at menarche, and then being overweight or obese predicted earlier menarche. For household food security, just the marginal food security category predicted earlier age at menarche compared to the high food security category. And then when we looked to see which variables significantly associate with each other, we found that household food security and ethnicity were significantly related, where in those who identify as white were more likely to be food secure than those who identify as Black or Hispanic, Mexican American. The multivariate regression model that we did first included food security and BMI. So we did not include allostatic load here because BMI is part of allostatic load. And we did not include race or ethnicity here because it was confounding with household food security. But what we find here is that our marginal food security group still significantly predicts earlier menarche, and our BMI categories continue to predict age at menarche. And then we did a second analysis using food security and allostatic load. And there we still see that marginal food security is predicting earlier age at menarche. Allostatic load was not significant in any of the analyses, the independent or the multivariate. So what we find with BMI is well documented in the literature. Energetics is nothing new to us. We know that it's important to have enough energy, and this determines your developmental rate and timing of certain developmental periods like puberty and menarche. However, food insecurity and menarche is new. This has only been published once before using a US sample, which was my master's thesis, where I found that being food insecure predicted earlier menarche using a survival hazard analysis. But here, food insecurity did not associate with BMI or allostatic load. So it seems like there's something independent going on with the experience of food insecurity in this sample. And it's only marginal food security that matters here. And we know that marginal food security is associated with like worrying and stressing and having anxiety about your food security. And those who are marginally food insecure in the US typically have incomes that are just above our assistance threshold, meaning that they don't qualify for assistance, but they still live paycheck to paycheck. They still struggle to pay everything on time, and often food is the last priority. But food security did associate with race and ethnicity, and so here it looks like what we're seeing is an example of systemic racism being physically embodied. So an example of inequality, unequal access to food, and also possibly the stress that comes along with racism and discrimination is being embodied and contributing to early menarche, because food security, or insecurity I should say, inequality and stress are cues of a risky environment. So in conclusion, living in households with marginal food security, particularly for girls who identify as non-white, is associated with earlier menarche, independent of allostatic load and BMI. The mechanisms underlying these associations obviously warrant further examination, but preventive initiatives should consider social determinants, including systemic racism, ethnic discrimination, marginalization, and food security within their policy and public health initiatives. And just going back to systemic racism, I could give a little bit of background on that. In the United States, in our country, the reason that we have a lot of this inequality, it's continual systemic racism, but also historical. What we have done is basically pushed, especially African American individuals, into the poorest neighborhoods, into poverty, and contributing to the cycle of poverty. And so those neighborhoods have less funding, they have poor access to healthcare, they are often food deserts, meaning that they don't have easy access to grocery stores or stores that have fresh foods, healthy foods. And then their school systems are often underfunded, so they have poor education. And so we just see this cycle of poverty that's happening. And so in public health, if we're going to understand and prevent these adult chronic diseases that are associated with earlier puberty, then we need to understand the social determinants that are causing this early puberty, which in this case, it looks like it's not only food insecurity, but also systemic racism. There are limitations here, of course. This is a cross-sectional study and longitudinal studies need to be conducted because we have some predictor variables that are post-menarche here, especially BMI is problematic because we don't know if BMI is causing that earlier puberty or it is an effect of puberty. And even though we used a weighted sample, the initial sample size of 424 girls is still small. And so for future studies should try to get a larger sample of girls at that age range. And I just want to thank Dr. Wiley. She's my advisor at Indiana University for all of her support and advice and help on the project. And then, of course, Dr. Ariana Da Silva for inviting me to talk today. Thank you.